let's do this. I'm so excited, honey. Like, we haven't done one of these in a long time. And also, like, this is my first time, like, collabing with you on something historical. And it made me feel like I was back in college. And it made me really happy.
Oh, I'm so happy, baby.
Yeah. I really love learning about history. It's one of the best things for me. It makes me come alive. And it makes me realize that, like, things can get really bad.
Yeah.
You know, but they also can get much better. Like, you know, most of us get our news from different sources. Like, I get a lot of my news from TikTok because it's firsthand accounts. Mm-hmm. It's firsthand accounts of what's going on, not just in the United States, but around the world. And it's also, I also get a lot of my news from Instagram. I don't feel like there's not really one news source that I trust fully.
Yeah.
To give them, like, you know, like the New York Times, I wouldn't pay $20 a month.
No.
To read any of their shit.
It's ridiculous every time that article pops up.
Yeah.
They used to give you free ones.
Yeah, they used to, and not anymore.
I don't think they give you. Washington Post and New York Times don't give you free ones, which is bullshit.
But I follow them on Instagram, and they still kind of give you the news anyway. So
yeah, and they have TikTok and Instagram. The Washington Post at least does. So it's TikTok and Instagram Shorts that break down the news for you. With news sources that are from everywhere, you can't trust anyone. No,
you can't. You have to. When you really want to know what's going on in the world, you cannot just take someone's word for it. And even if they say they have evidence backing up their claim, you have to do research on that evidence. You can't just watch a video and be like, you know what I heard on so-and-so? This is happening, and this is their backup. How many times has that happened? And then someone will come out and be like, that's absolutely not true, and here's the actual proof. So please do your goddamn research. Don't just come into people. Don't just watch one video or read one article and then think you know all about everything. Like, you need to do your own research. If you want to talk about what is going on in the world and you have an opinion on it and you want to spout your opinion, do your research before talking to someone about it. And then, because then otherwise you're going to just make everyone assholes in the situation, because you're going to look like an asshole. And then the person that you're talking to is going to feel like an asshole. And like, we all don't want to be assholes, right? Like, just do your fucking research. It's really not that hard.
I mean, like, it's the hardest thing in the world to do, but you got to try to prove yourself wrong.
Exactly. And that's one of the things, as a historian, you try your best to prove yourself wrong. When you're doing research, you're like, okay, listen, unless you know it to be true, unless you know that, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that what you are researching, you know, is true. What you're writing about, you know, is true. It happened to you. Mm-hmm. You're right. You are trying your best. It's almost like the scientific theory, where you are trying to, the scientific method helps in finding a scientific theory, because if you do the experiment over and over and over again and it keeps coming out with that, then you know beyond a shadow of a doubt this theory it lasts and it's true, and you throw other aspects into it. It's the same thing with research.
Yeah, there's a phrase for it. It's testable, measurable, repeatable. So if you have to be able to make a test for it, you have to be able to measure the results, and then you have to be able to repeat those tests and measure the results, and then you come up with a theory or conclusion.
Exactly.
So, like, yeah, it's very similar to do that in history.
And that sounds like a lot of work, but it really isn't. It's really not that hard to be educated and well educated. It's really not that hard to read 3 different articles. If you had time for that one article, you definitely have time for 2 other articles or a firsthand account. Like, it's not hard to find. But anyways, hello. Welcome back to All That Work for Nothing podcast. Thank you so much for allowing us to take last week off. We have been hard at work. Speaking of research, we have been doing research. It has come to a point in the world where there is a lot going on. It is a very pivotal year for us in the United States because we have a presidential election coming up. And for many people, it doesn't matter if you're on the right or the left, We are so divided in this country politically that we all feel that this is a pivotal moment in American history, and that if the wrong person gets into power, that democracy as we know it will crumble. Am I right?
I mean, those are the stakes. So
those are the stakes, and it doesn't matter.
Big.
It really doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, and we'll get into. We can do a whole other podcast on how it's come to only be a two-party system and how corrupt that system is, where it's only Democrat and Republican and no other party. But anyways, we're not getting into that today. We are going to be talking about 1968.
Down. Cue the 60s music.
Cue the 60s music.
Do,
so
do, 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 do.
So we're going to be talking about 1968, and for many of you who know, that 1968 was a very pivotal presidential election year. We were in the middle of the Vietnam War, or the Vietnam conflict, as we like to call it, because we lost that war. And so we decided not to call it a war. We called it a conflict.
Doesn't count.
Doesn't count. Doesn't count.
Doesn't count. No takesies, backsies.
No takesies, backsies.
Double or nothing. That's my bubble gun.
Yep. So in 1968, there's a lot going on, and you kind of have to know like a little bit of the context. We're not going to get all the way into 1968 because this podcast isn't just about that. Mm-hmm. What we're doing is we're comparing and we're contrasting to what's going on today and what's going on back in those times. And there's a lot of similarities, and one of the biggest things that historians will tell you over and over again is that history repeats itself. And it's really cool to be able to, when you know history, and as we do, it's really cool, but also terrifying to watch it in real time, because you know the stakes. As a historian, like, you know that if one thing goes wrong, or if one person comes in and says this thing or does a certain thing, it can all go wrong. So we are all on the edge of our seats right now. Not just us, but like everyone in the country and in the world right now.
It's kind of like watching a horror movie when you know the end.
Yeah.
And nobody else does. And they're all going to jump, but you're like, nah, I already know the ending. They're not going to make it.
Exactly.
They're all going to die in that cabin in the woods. Well, we are both history majors. We actually met working at a history museum, and it was one of the first things we talked about, and it was kind of our initial core interest, mm-hmm. and it's grown from there. This is the first time we're collabing on a project. There's other research projects we've done. You had an amazing podcast that, if you are curious in the 60s, just as a culture or vibe, Doriel's old podcast on Woodstock is incredible.
Oh, thank you.
100% recommend checking it out.
I really liked the one on MK Ultra too.
MK Ultra is another one that also is kind of
that one was
60s.
Fascinating.
Yes, so those two are amazing. And if you want to learn more about the 60s, that's definitely a good place to go. For this one, we are, like Doriel said, going to be doing it on 1968, and I think both of us kind of like had a similar fascination with the 60s because, one of our first talks was Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
Conspiracy theories.
Yes.
We did another podcast similar to this where we watched a documentary on what was it, the 50th?
Oh, yes.
The 60th.
It was the 60th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Yes. So I think
I did not upload that, remember? Because it was a very hard episode.
Oh,
I cried most of it because it was very...
Oh, right.
It hit me hard.
Well, we attempted a similar project
Yes.
to this about the Kennedy assassination. We watched a documentary with a lot of primary sources for the 60th anniversary.
If you haven't seen that documentary, I highly recommend it. It's very
emotional.
It's very it's very heavy.
Yeah.
It's a 3-part series. What is it on?
It was on Nat Geo. So if you have if you have Disney Plus, you should be able to access
Yeah, it's on Disney
Nat
Plus.
Geo.
You should be able to get it. But it's, what is it called again?
Oh,
it was like,
good question.
oh, what was it called?
We will find out. Put it down below.
Yes, I cannot remember. It was a really good title because it was literally just the day of the event.
Yeah.
And then the day after the event.
Yeah, because it only goes through that weekend.
It's
a ton of primary sources.
It's a ton of primary sources. Like, for the first time ever, they were talking to people that were there, and they talked to Jacqueline Kennedy's Secret Service agent, and then other Secret Service agents that were also there.
Yeah, and they talked to some of the people who worked in the hospital too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great documentary.
It's a really, really good one, so I highly recommend it.
Now, the documentary we used for this episode is on HBO Max. Is through CNN, and it's called 1968. And it's a 4-part series that goes through all the seasons. So it starts in winter with January, then into spring, summer, and then it ends with fall. So
with the election. With
the election, yes. So we're going to be focusing mostly on, I would say, the spring aspect of it. And then we're going to also kind of, for a political perspective, we're going to be going kind of through the entire year. But we are going to start talking about why we're doing this. Mm-hmm. What is our mission? What is our goal?
Why should you keep listening as a listener?
And as Doriel said, not noticing history doesn't stop it from repeating itself.
Exactly.
And being on the sidelines isn't going to make the result any different. So we want to recognize history because it gives us an opportunity to make wiser, better, improved choices for our lives today. And there's a lot of revisionist and reactionary, dangerous, misleading history, particularly in the United States, particularly on the internet. Mm-hmm. And I think since we have these backgrounds, these interests, and this platform, that we have an obligation to try to counter that misinformation. And the only way, the best way, the most effective way to do that is by putting correct, researched, informed content out there regarding history. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're going to try to do.
We didn't just get our sources from that documentary. Right. We also watched 3 separate firsthand accounts of protesters that were protesting the Vietnam War while also protesting the way Jim Crow laws in America at that time in the 1960s. And it was very cool because they were also comparing and contrasting to what they went through compared to what it looks like today. So we're gonna touch on that, and then we also want to kind of go a little bit into how you should find your sources and what kind of sources you should be looking for, and making sure that the research you're doing is actually viable and not just propaganda. Because there is a lot, like Shane was saying, there is a lot of propaganda out there, especially on the internet. The age of the internet has really kind of muddled what a primary source is. What we want to do is we want to tell you exactly how you can find the sources and how you can fact check yourself and other people. You can have the tough conversations with people. We're not making this podcast for a Democrat or Republican perspective. We're making this as a United States citizen perspective. Yes. And what the government is doing to infringe upon our rights as American citizens, put into our constitutional rights. The constitutional rights are being stepped on right now, and that's what we're trying to get at.
I think we're going to talk about 2 institutions that are critical to keeping those rights and the ones that aren't doing their job.
Exactly.
The first one we're going to talk about is universities. The time period we're going to talk about in 1968, the most famous campus uprising, similar to the ones we're having now, was in Columbia. kind of similar to how it's happening now.
Exactly where it happened again.
Right. Now, the current protests have to do with divestment. So what that means is that they don't want the universities to work with companies that are also working with Israel. Now, in the 1968, it was two things we learned about in that documentary. The first, like you talked about, was what they called Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Do you remember, like, they were trying to build the gym?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, so that kind of has to do with, like, the Columbia is in the northern part, I guess, of Manhattan, near Harlem, and they're trying to build into Harlem. And, of course, Columbia is a fancy Ivy League school full of fucking rich kids.
Yes.
And Harlem is usually a part of New York that's known for being a neighborhood where mostly black people live. Mm-hmm. And during this time, it was the style at the time to kick black people out of their neighborhoods to make things that benefited rich people, like a gym for Columbia.
Yeah.
They were going to bulldoze City Park, and put a gym in there.
Mm-hmm.
So that had been happening for a while, and the Columbia students were obviously opposed to this. And what really started to get them moving was when they found out that Columbia is working with a think tank, kind of a strategies organization that primarily worked for strategies that helped towards the war.
Yes.
So they were basically assisting in a war that a lot of kids these students' age were going to fight in.
Yes.
Because we got to remember that this was a time period where the most Americans were in Vietnam ever. There's about 500,000 Americans in there. You could get drafted.
Yep.
It's crazy to me that
that is something that we need to bring up, is that a lot of the reason we oppose the war at this point is because there was a draft, and LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, the president who took over after Kennedy was assassinated, he kind of inherited this mess of a war, and he was like, okay, what do? I don't know what to do. So we talked about how LBJ came into a mess. He inherited a mess. People were so sad after Kennedy was assassinated, and they were distraught. We were distraught as a nation, and LBJ kind of came in and was like, okay, this is my time. This is my legacy. What's going to be my legacy? And that's kind of, every person who knows about any government thing, it's like they all want to leave their legacy, and what's going to be my legacy? And so his thing was, okay, how are we going to win the Vietnam War? And so he came in strong. He strong-armed it, and he basically sent hundreds of thousands of these kids who did not want to go to the war. Because this is also a time that we're in the middle of the counterculture movement. We're in the time where hippies are, but they're like the loudest part of a specific population in the United States right now. There's that, and then there's also the race riots that are going on.
Right. Oh, and that was the other thing. So this is all happening 3 weeks after Martin Luther King gets assassinated.
Yes. So LBJ kind of, he strong arms the Vietnam conflict, and he comes in and he's like, okay, we're going to send a bunch of kids over there, whether you like it or not. And so at this point in 1968, it's been 3 years of fighting, and these kids are getting sent over, and there's a lottery, and like a lot of, he also promised, like, I won't escalate it again. And he did. He lied, and he escalated it again because we were losing. Another thing to note around this time too is that this is the first time that Americans can watch the war on their TV screens. Mm-hmm. So we're at home and we're turning on our TV and we're watching this war in real time. And so what used to work back in like World War I, World War II is that we didn't see what these soldiers were seeing. We kind of just, took like the journalists over there. We took them at their word. We wouldn't find out a lot until, these veterans would come home and tell us their horrendous stories about, what the Nazis were doing and what Germany was doing and the aggressors and all that. So this is the first time that we are because we didn't have this for the Korean War.
No.
We just sent these soldiers over there and we're like, okay, well, we'll write about you.
No, it really was. It's called the Forgotten War.
It is the Forgotten War for sure.
Because it's in between the one we lost and the one we won.
It's also it's also another a conflict because we did not. It was a very messy war. So we still okay. It is the Forgotten War, but there were still people that remembered the Korean War at this point, and were like, we're going back to war? Why? Yeah. We just lost our freaking president like a year ago. Do you not remember this shit? Like, we just lost him. Why are we going to another war? Also, we just had a war. Like, we just got out of freaking Korea. And a lot of people still remember that they had just gotten out of World War II. So at this point, Americans are exhausted. We are tired of the war, and especially the counterculture movement, the hippies. So they start clashing with the majority of people in the United States and their like what they believe. And so now we get this giant group of people working together to get across like, hey, things aren't great right now. They started pointing their finger at the government and being like, bro, what are you doing? And then we realized like, oh, we have a voice. We can use our voice and we can start protesting. And that's where we end up in 1968.
Yeah, so like protests have been happening on college campuses since like 65.
Yeah.
Kind of like we were talking about the Beach Boys earlier.
Yeah.
They had the song where it all started out at Berkeley now.
Mm-hmm.
It was about like free speech because you couldn't hand out like anti-war pamphlets
right.
and things like that. It's crazy to see that Berkeley footage when they're all like, you know, clean cuts and look so good because it's 1965. It's before shit really got crazy. But we're in the heart of it. We're in 1968. And yeah, you brought up about Johnson. So Johnson had been like lying that whole time because he campaigned in 1964 for not going to war.
Yes.
Because he wanted to juxtapose himself to crazy ass Goldwater, who we'll come back to. Yeah, and then in 66 and 67, the narrative was kind of like, hey, we're winning, we're so close to winning, like you don't even believe it. And then at the start of this year is the Tet Offensive. There's if you want to kind of go more into U.S. military policy during this time, the Secretary of Defense for this time was a guy named Robert McNamara, and he made a really great documentary called Fog of War. And so that one is really good if you want to learn kind of more about like what the military and the government's plan that didn't go right was for Vietnam. So that's a good one. And then that, you know, scares the shit out of people because even though like we win the Tet Offensive, we don't really like win the Tet Offensive. It's clear that we're not anywhere close to being done. And so now you get these kids that are terrified of getting drafted that have and
also are watching this. They're watching us lose in real time for a war that makes no sense to anybody at home. So it's just like tensions are rising.
Yes, they are like rising all over the place, and they had been organizing these protests for months now. Anti-war protests have been going on for years. They have been kind of ratcheting it up at college campuses, especially Columbia, once this information found out about that think tank and everything like that. So they organize a rally, and this is the Students for a Democratic Society. And so like they're kind of like SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. So basically they did all the they were more known for doing like the civil rights protests in the 60s.
Right.
And they were same thing, started on college campuses, a lot of kids getting organized, and it happens here in 1968, and they have a big rally. They have a big anti-war rally, and that is on April 23rd, and the guy who was only 20 years old was a guy named Mark Rudd. He was the chairman, and he organized the rally, and then eventually gets out of hand, and they start taking over halls. And I didn't realize this. They didn't just take over Hamilton Hall. They took over 5 buildings.
Yeah, they did.
5 classrooms.
5 buildings, yep.
Cops don't get called in yet. They're there for like a few days. They're there for like a week total. And they just are sleeping and hanging out and chanting. People are throwing food to them. Yep. Like it looks like a part. And they actually stopped kids from going to class. That was the other thing.
Did. That was another thing is what one of the things that juxtaposes today's rallies or peaceful protests is the fact that they completely made it so that there was no going to class. Like, you had to deal with them if you were, and also like pretty much at this point, pretty much all students had kind of joined this thing, because he said there was like 10,000 people at one point where they were like, okay, well, now we're just going to get more people to join. And so there was no possible way that you could get on this campus and go to class. And right now what's happening is that students have created encampments. Yeah, the Gaza Solidarity Camp. And what they are calling for is for divestment, in the same way that we asked for divestment in the 68. Divesting the companies that they are, because it's a whole thing, y'all. And one of the things that we will probably touch on again is follow the money. One of the things you can do when you want to do research is follow the money.
Well, that's another interesting thing that we're going to talk about, because the way the 1968 story ends is that the police are called in on April 30th, and they violently, like the footage of this from the documentary is very shocking. Yeah, just how violent these guys were, just how they came in and just started ripping people out.
Oh yeah. And I'm pretty sure they said 150 people ended up in the hospital after that.
Yeah, it was 100. It was like 700 people arrested. 150 people ended up in the hospital because, I mean, I guess the only thing cops knew how to do was club back then, because there's so much clubbing. Well,
they showed up in riot gear just like they are today.
I mean, they didn't. I don't even know if they had riot gear back then. They just had club. All I know is club.
That's all they know is club.
All I know is club. I club. All I know.
Yeah.
So it's brutal to watch. It's brutal to watch these kids getting like beaten up. And Mark Rudd, we hear him on the bullhorn in one of the recordings, and he's like, "This is a nonviolent protest. If there's any violence that happens, it's going to be from the police.
It's going to be from the police. It's not going to be from us." There was also some propaganda going on with these protests as well, where they were making it seem as though these students were not peacefully protesting.
Right.
They were making it seem as though they were, creating havoc. And yes, you know what? There are people that come to these protests and they have the absolute wrong idea of what a peaceful protest looks like. And sometimes people in the counterculture will come, like the counter protesters will come in and they'll infiltrate and make it look like they are part of this peaceful protest when they absolutely are not. And what they're trying to do is make the protesters look like the bad guys. And we saw this in the Black Lives Matter movement back in 2020, where we had anarchists coming out and ruining property, and they had nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter movement whatsoever. It's seen time and time again, where we have these counter protesters coming in, creating violence, and then the press will run with that, and they'll be like, "Oh, see how these students are being so violent." Mm-hmm. This country is very loud about how we do not like Muslims. We do not like people from the Middle East. We have always had a very tumultuous relationship with the Middle East in this country, and we have, especially after the September 11th attacks, we were very open about not liking people with turbans or people that did not represent the Christian majority in this country. And it is absolutely being seen right now. Not all Muslims are terrorists. And if you believe that, then you are not well informed. The same thing can be said for any religious group. There are people that will take things too far. And there are people who are white, who are also considered terrorists. I would consider people going in and shooting up schools terrorists.
Right. It's a classification that doesn't really have a race attached to it.
It doesn't.
But we did that. In our minds, we have, like, through decades of propaganda, we have affixed in our minds a connection that never existed before.
And who is spreading that propaganda?
The news.
Exactly.
Yes. Like, especially us growing up in the time we did with a 24-hour news.
Yes.
I think that the 9/11 attacks mixed with 24-hour news was just a recipe for disaster in terms of the image of Muslim and Arab people in this country.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening today is people are linking young people to that, which they did back then as well.
Yes.
So they link young people with some sort of like threat to the country, like, which is insane when you think that these are college students.
Yeah.
Because that's really what it comes down to. The similarities is the measurement of the response, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they did, these 60s protesters, these Columbia students, yeah, they broke into a hall, and you can say that's the end of the peaceful protest, right? That's a violent act or whatever, right? But your response to a violent act of breaking into a classroom with sending cops in to beat the shit out of all the kids there and drag them off to the hospital or to arrest them. We also heard the firsthand accounts. We saw clips. If you want to see the entire video, you can. It's called Columbia Revolts. Mm-hmm. And it was a student film taken during the Takeover.
Yeah.
We watched clips of that. And one of the first-hand accounts you hear is of doctors begging the police not to drag people away, and the cops dragging them away anyway.
Yeah.
And we see all these people coming out with, like, busted-up faces. So your response to them shutting down the class for a certain amount of time is just not the same.
Yeah.
And especially because what's really upsetting about this, the most upsetting video, was by one of the members of the Students for a Democratic Society, Juan González, when he talked about like how much students now are getting cracked down in a way that they weren't back when he was there. He talked about how they were there for like basically a week. Mm-hmm. So this happens on the 23rd, and they're like asked to leave and everything like that. I didn't realize this, but I don't think until I put the timeline together that the Columbia one from this year, they organized on the April 17th, right?
Yeah.
They organized on April 17th, and on the 18th, they were all arrested and pulled off school.
Yeah.
And then they came back, and then that's what we had for about 2-ish weeks until they got arrested again on the same day, 56
the exact
years.
same day,
the
56 years later.
56 years later.
It's like we were saying, history repeats itself, and sometimes it's right on the nose, and it's a little terrifying. It's crazy that this is all happening at the same time that other events have already happened. When we say history repeats itself, we don't just say that to be annoying. It's fucking true. Like you gotta look at it. And the reason why it's so important for us to be juxtaposing what's going on with the students here, and juxtaposing it to 1968 and what those students were doing, we can see an avenue that we can take as citizens to talk about what we do not like and how we can take our power back. And that's one of the greatest things about this country, is that we were founded by the people for the people. Am I right? Or am I wrong? No, but we were founded on the idea that people, the citizens, will vote for the policies and the policy makers who we believe have the best self-interest for this country. And we have such a political divide in this country right now that no one on either side of the party line are happy with how things are being run. And we also realize that the self-interest of the 1% of the population is what is being pushed right now. And so that's why I was saying that this podcast, while we definitely have different political views from other people who don't believe that these kids that are protesting Palestine should be protesting Palestine, I highly disagree with you. I think that it is a right of our American citizenship to be able to fight for what we want. And it is absolutely a peaceful protest, whether you believe that or not. We have firsthand accounts that we have done our best to try to find evidence that these pro-Palestinian groups were saying racial slurs towards Jewish people. We can't find anything. We have firsthand accounts from someone who is going to a school right now that is in the middle of a protest, and there is no such thing. Most of the firsthand accounts I hear on TikTok are from these pro-Palestinian groups are that they feel heard, that they feel seen, that they feel like it's the most diverse place that they've ever been been, and that they feel so welcomed and loving. And they even had Passover on one of the days in this event. So you cannot just come in saying that it's a hateful and that it's violent, because it's not. It has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with human rights. And we are directly giving money to another government of another country to annihilate an entire people. And if you think that they would not do that to you, you're absolutely wrong. And there's so much evidence backing me. Like I said, follow the money. The richest elite of this world are in everyone's pocket. And please do your research. And right and left, it doesn't matter what side you're on. We all know that this country is corrupt, that our political leaders, every single one of them, is corrupt.
So just a couple more things, and then I think we're going to move on to the next thing.
Yes.
But I wanted to add on to what you said, because remember Juan González, when we were listening to his interview,
yes,
said that this was one of the most diverse places, like to compare it to the Columbia protests of 1968, it was far more diverse. And
far more diverse,
One of the most diverse college campuses. It just goes to reflect what America looks like now.
Yeah.
Which we'll talk more about that later too. Like, this is what America looks like now, and there are people who are happy about it. But in 1968, it was mostly white kids. It was mostly a white campus with an active black minority that was very vital to this protest and took a leading role for years, even before students were Democratic Society. The demographics were definitely different.
Yes.
And Juan González brings up an interesting point, that the patience that was kind of shown initially with the
majority white.
Yeah, with the 1968 protest probably had a lot to do with the fact that they were majority white.
Yes.
And the fact that college campuses are so eager, many of them are so eager to get these encampments broken up and using force to do it is because of the more diverse makeup of the students. Yeah.
He was saying that a lot of the white students kind of got let off easy. Yeah. So if they were suspended, they basically would make a plea with them like, okay, sure, you just can't, protest anymore, and then you can come back into our university and get your degree. A lot of the students that were people of color were not shown the same respect. Juan actually said he didn't even get his degree because he was a senior that year, and he didn't even get his degree for another 30 years.
Yeah.
They basically gave him an honorary degree because they realized what they had done was wrong.
He said they begged them to come back.
Yeah.
The other thing he brought up was that they had a tribunal where they actually got to plead their case before they were suspended.
Yeah.
What I read was that the protesters that were arrested the first time in the 18th of April, they got suspended like the next day. They got an email saying they were suspended the next day. So the total lack of patience, respect that Columbia showed to these protesters was really alarming.
It was, yeah.
There's one more thing. So I did really look. I really looked for hard evidence of rampant anti-Semitism in these encampments. And I didn't find anything that was
damning.
No, because
they're not chanting anything that's anti-Semitic. As the Prime Minister of Israel has tried to tell his citizens that that the protesters are saying screaming anti-Semitic remarks. That is not happening. With the technology that we have today, don't you think that would be shown on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, wherever news is being, filtered right now? Don't you think that we would see hundreds of posts about this, and that, and also, I haven't seen any sort of news outlet who would absolutely jump on this, because their whole rhetoric right now is that it's anti-Semite. That's not what anyone is saying. And if you think that, you're being ignorant, and you need to do your research before you decide that. If you have a baseless claim like that, that is what we're talking about, how this can become dangerous. So do your research. Check your ego and do your research. That's one of the biggest things that you can do. If you are of the mind that these pro-Palestinian groups are anti-Semites, are hateful, and that they are trying to help the Hamas effort, please check your ego and do your research, and then come back to us. And you need to make sure that the research that you're doing is actually viable. So if you come out and you say, oh, I found this, this, and this, we're going to do our own research, and we're going to juxtapose you. And we're going to be like, we're going to school you. We have our degrees in history, bud. Okay? So I am all for friendly banter and political discourse. But when it comes to human rights, you can't say that that the people that are protesting, that are fighting for human rights, are hateful in some way. I don't understand this rhetoric. I really don't understand it. And you have to see that propaganda is being passed around by the government today because they do not want us using our rights as citizens. And that it doesn't matter if you're left or right. You have every right to go and protest something. It's in the Constitution. It's a constitutional right. So we are within our constitutional rights to check the government's power. And that's what we need to do. That's another reason we decided to make this podcast today. So I'll let you take that over.
Well, just as a final review. So we have the 1968 protesters who took over 5 classrooms, shut down classes for about a week. Then they get broken up by the cops, are allowed to stand in front of a tribunal and plead their case before they are suspended. And compared to the students who were at Columbia in 2024, they were all over, like, having some volatile imagery because we saw them carrying those Viet Cong flags.
Yeah.
If you want to say the Viet Cong were the good guy, actually, that's another primary source thing because the people of Vietnam would disagree with you.
They would absolutely disagree with you.
Because there isn't really a good guy or a bad guy in this case.
No.
Now, we shouldn't have been there, but that doesn't automatically by default make the Viet Cong the good guy. And then more inflammatory is that what I saw in one of the pictures from them taking over Hamilton Hall was them holding up Chairman Mao pictures. And by this point, it was pretty well known that Chairman Mao was a piece of shit and not somebody you wanted to emulate. But I don't think we had the access to information that we did now that they did back then. So you had a more ignorant, more aggressive group of people that were given more patience and that were given more respect than what we're seeing now.
Yes.
So I think the biggest comparison to make is how these universities are responding, because we have seen a scary move towards a more fascist response from these universities.
One of the laws that the government right now is trying to pass is the fact that if you question the Israel war, that you are an anti-Semite, that you are creating hate speech. And that is absolutely not true. Those do not coexist together. What we are protesting, like I said, is this is a humanitarian terrorist act. It is a genocide. And if you look at that and you can't see that because you're not seeing, you obviously aren't watching these videos that I see of children being orphaned, children losing limbs, kids that can't eat, kids that aren't going to be able to grow up and live a normal life. It's a humanitarian crisis right now. And it's something that the government, they need to do their job and they need to step in. And we are not the only ones protesting this, y'all. People around the world are also protesting this shit. And for you to say that the people that are pro-Palestinian are anti-Semites is just egregious. It's insane, and like I said, it's baseless. It really is baseless because it has nothing to do with religion. It really doesn't. there's nothing to do with that. And so what we also wanted to get across to is this is a huge turning point right now. People are finally getting up and they're protesting something that they believe in, right? We are in the middle of a class war in America at this point. The middle class does not exist here anymore. The amount of people that are living paycheck to paycheck, who have their degrees, who did all the right things, and who still can't get a house, they can't afford their groceries. We're also realizing that the government is allowing these companies to put horrible ingredients into our food and not regulating that. People don't have regular access to healthcare. Like this is also a humanitarian crisis that we have going on in our country right now. And it has to do with the fact that the 1% owns our politicians. So what we need to do is we need to stop fighting amongst each other. We need to stop looking at this propaganda. We need to do our research, and we need to come together as a country, and we need to take back this country together. That is why this country was so great and why we need to fight for it. So that's all I want to say. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, there's just a few things. So I'm going to kind of button hook this with what you said right there, because before the protesters were arrested by the cops in the riot gear, like going through the window, in the middle of New York City, they wanted 3 demands. So one was divestment. Mm-hmm. The last one was amnesty. And the second one was financial transparency. Mm-hmm. Because what they don't tell you is that we don't know if Colombia even has any dealings with a company in Israel. Most likely they do.
Most likely.
But we don't know because they don't have to tell us.
Well, see, that's the thing is we sort of know that they definitely do because they refuse to show us. The way that they're acting, kind of their actions are speaking louder than their words right now. So I fully believe that they have some dealings with companies that are aiding in what's going on in Gaza.
And the president, we want to talk about the president real quick.
Yes.
Because her name is President Shafiq. She is somebody who has worked for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in the past, and we won't go too deep into those things today. But just to surmise, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are organizations that have a purpose that is kind of like countries outsource colonialism to these organizations. So their goal is to make it so that the colonized nations stay indebted and stay underneath the thumb of the formerly colonizer nations. So they are the ones that push a policy that's kind of called neoliberal now, which is like everybody trades, free trade, even though like that's not how we built our country, but that's how they're going to build their countries because it serves our best interest. So that is what the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank try to accomplish. They do not try to accomplish any goal that helps people who are in need. They help create economic stability for the economic haves by exploiting the people who are the have-nots. That is their whole purpose for being. And she was the youngest vice president, I believe, of either World Bank or International Monetary Fund. So the reason why she was given this president's job was because she wanted to she was entrusted to keep the next generation still buying into that. She was put there because she could be trusted that things like this wouldn't happen, that they wouldn't have a radical student population, and that they wouldn't have kids that wanted to actually see change in the way the world is run.
Right.
And it's like that across universities where it's created this sort of like upper class academia, sort of liberal and sort of not.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like what you said before, where it's like you can't really look at things in a left and right thing here, because I think a lot of these people would be considered, they probably are registered or voted Democrat, but they're not our allies.
No, they are not.
They are there to exploit the same way a corporation is there to exploit.
Exactly.
And I think the way we need to start looking at universities is that they are just the same as corporations.
They are.
They have a board of trustees.
They have their own self-interest.
Right. And it is their self-interest is not to educate us.
No.
Their self-interest is not to make it so that society is better because people are more educated and that people can understand what's happening to them and that people can actually solve problems. They are there to sell the business of a degree. They have a product. The product is the degree. They have a clientele, which is a bunch of kids coming right out of high school, or people who are older and try to get a degree to improve their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's their clientele. Then they have a board that makes sure that all this is looked after. I think some even have corporations. So, for example, Brown, who solved this similar problem but in a peaceful manner, they are going to have a vote in October to divest that is going to be held by the corporation of Brown that runs their finances. State institutions have a weird relationship where the government supports their sort of corporate profiteering, and they also diversify, right? What do you think college sports are? Like, I love college sports, but what essentially that is that's the same thing as a company like the owners of Walmart buying a sports team.
Yeah.
They want to diversify. They need to
Exactly.
diversify their portfolio. And that's why they have these contracts with these companies to begin with. They are a corporation negotiating with other corporations, profiteering off of a genocide. So we need to stop looking at universities like these ancient institutions that are there for our betterment and start looking at them that they are just the same kind of places that are there to exploit us.
Yes. And it it's like I was saying too, there is a humanitarian crisis going on in this country as well. We need to start fighting. And this is the first stone, I feel, as a historian, someone who has looked at events like this in the past. This was the first stone thrown. It is now our turn as citizens to stand up together, stop fighting each other, come together and take our nation back and get the things that we were promised to get when we were growing up. So thank you for listening. I think we're going to stop there. Let us know your thoughts, and please check your ego and check your sources before you decide to leave a hate comment, because it's really not going to help anything. Like, what this really is we should stop fighting. Like, it needs to stop. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, follow the money. I think that's what I should call this episode, is follow the money.
Follow
really.
the money.
Follow the money. If you properly follow the money, you will find a very, very corrupt system around the world that needs to be stopped. And we have so many people on our side as citizens. So we absolutely can get together. And the whole reason they want us to fight is so that we don't fight.
You should label the episode Follow the Money when I talk about Nixon. Oh. Nixon. I could go on and on about Nixon.
Also, the reason why the political environment is the way that it is today is directly linked to the 1968 election and the shitty, creepy shit that Nixon was doing behind the backs of citizens. Anyways, we're going to drop the mic there, and we will see you next week. Thank you.
Follow us on all the sites. We're on TikTok. We're on Instagram. We are wherever podcasts are listened to, and this full episode is available on YouTube.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.